Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Henry Schein Dental Academy webinar series. My name is Adam, Marketing Specialist, and I'll be your moderator. It's always a pleasure to welcome back Eric Pook as our speaker. Tonight, Eric will review if owning or listing your dental space is best for you. Eric is the Managing Director for Cirrus Consulting Group. Before we get started, we have a couple reminders for you. At any point during tonight's webinar, we encourage your participation through the chat and Q&A features. Please type any questions you might have into the Q&A section of your control panel, and we'll answer them live at the end of the presentation. Henry Schein is not offering CE credit for viewing or attending this presentation live or on demand. And this webinar is sponsored by Henry Schein's Dental Business Institute, as well as Cirrus Consulting. Eric, thanks for being with us again. Looking forward to it.
Adam, a pleasure. Welcome, everyone. Looks like we've got some great attendees tonight, and a bunch are coming in as well, so appreciate everyone's attendance and time. Adam and I have done a number of these through the pandemic as things were ramping up in March with a few thousand candidates, and definitely looking forward to sharing some key best practices and really what we're seeing throughout the industry today. So greatly appreciated everyone's time. I would certainly echo Adam's comments. It is an incredible opportunity to make this interactive tonight. It seems like everyone's lots of Zooms, no shortage of CEs and otherwise these days via remote. So I would strongly encourage you to post some questions to the Q&A throughout. In a moment, we're also going to do some polling questions, because we'll customize the content based on the users we have on tonight and the doctors we have throughout the country, and based on their situations, let that be early career, mid-career, end careers, if they're in a lease situation today, if they own their own property, and if so, right, do they have a lease in place from that perspective? So really looking forward to going through some brand new content, sharing exactly what we've seen from our hundreds and hundreds of active negotiations going on from Anchorage to Honolulu to Key West to Halifax and everything in between throughout the continent. So welcome. Tonight's content is owning versus leasing your space. You can't imagine how many times I get that question. What's better for you and your practice in 2021? So we do get lots of questions. I really want to share a lot of updated market data and information. I am the president at Cirrus Consulting Group. Cirrus, if you're unaware, is pretty unique. We are the only healthcare specialized tenant representation firm of our kind in North America. We've been advising doctors now for over 26 years. We've done over 12,000 successful lease negotiations, and we're some of the foremost experts in the space. Some of our team have been with us negotiating leases now for over 18 years. Also, we've got some great individuals that used to work for the landlord. And now we've brought them on board from the dark side to now represent the dentist rather than negotiating against the dentist. So share a lot of those best practices tonight. Perfect. So let's pull up a quick poll. So just to get a sense of the room, goals, and objectives for this evening, if you could take a quick moment, either on your smartphone, if you're driving, please don't. But if you do have an opportunity, first question is, what best describes your situation? So if you're planning to open or relocate the practice, planning to acquire a practice, planning to transition, planning to stay and renegotiate, right? Or if you own and you're looking to create a lease, you can put none of the above. Number two is specifically now based on your specific situation, right? Why are you taking the course? Are you looking for guidance, need helping with the lease, or just for general knowledge? In addition, question three, when does your current lease expire? And then you can denote if you are the owner, 5 years, 2 to 5 years, and if you're in a month-to-month situation, that would be certainly something that you would want to address. We'll touch on the implications of that through COVID. Number four is, do you plan to start or buy a practice? If you're looking glass half full, a little Rockefeller approach, we're going to touch on a lot of positivity and best practices of what we're seeing throughout of doctors looking to expand, relocate, and really looking at an opportunity now to seize some pretty incredible market factors. And last but not least, again, for those of you that are wondering what fair market rent is for them and their practice, definitely click yes on number 5, and we'll be able to pull some market rate analysis for you, just in appreciation of taking the course. Great. Looks like we've got lots of attendees on. So if you can, just take a quick moment just to finish the poll. While we keep that open for an extra minute, This is the age-old question, right? Should I buy my property or should I lease it? Where do we sit? Where do we see the opportunities and what impact? And without spoiling any of the content, certainly some things to consider now are a few things that are going on around us. And in many areas, especially urban areas, the market has shifted. Thank you, Adam. The market has shifted to being, with a lot of rise in vacancies, has created a unique opportunity for dental tenants. And as the world is switching to remote and Silicon Valley and a lot of different, obviously, aspects of the country, or people working from home, there is, in most markets, a rise in vacancies and a shift in the commercial real estate space. Yet what we've determined through all of the impact of 2020 is that the dentist can never work from home. Seems obvious, but it's now created a unique opportunity where the dental tenant now, you represent, in my opinion, the absolute best tenant on the planet. You have the highest build-out costs of any other commercial tenant, right? From that perspective, the clinic is usually there for over 26 and a half years. In addition, we now also have the scenario where the default rates are incredibly low. In most cases, for a dental tenant, less than 0.5%. Compare that to a retail, let alone a retail restaurant or otherwise going through the craziness of COVID-19, right? Dramatically puts the dental tenant in a whole other class in amongst itself, let alone the fact that you bring in great high quality foot traffic to your individual building, malls, or otherwise. So let's jump in, shall we? So now when we talk about what's best for you, let's look at the market. So right now, I had my real estate analytics team pull up the specific reports just from a few markets where a number of you are attending from this evening. Number one, San Francisco, very unique. What we're looking through here in orange is the vacancy rates, and in blue is the market price per square foot. Now, as you can tell, 2016, and actually going back to 2008, right, when there was the massive Great Recession. I was living in California, late 2009. Right. And at that point, Ocean Avenue, they couldn't give away properties and space and hotel rooms and otherwise. So those doctors that created a lease back in 2008 and 2009 in San Francisco were able to benefit from unbelievably low rents, and they rode that wave for 10 years and then had a rude awakening at that first renewal. So now coming up to those renewal, if they were coming up in mid 2019, right, that saw a very high market price, well over $65 per square foot. But look at this, with the impact of COVID-19, right, vacancy rates dramatically increasing from about 5 to 11%. And the forecast is that that's still going to rise through 2021 before leveling back out. So again, in my opinion, as we're now entering into 2021, it's creating this supply and demand where it does create a massive gap between vacancies and rental rates. What does that mean for you? Well, as a dental tenant, it means more leverage, more opportunity to help to protect yourself and your business based on the external factors. Just ask yourself, as you were driving into work this morning, how many for lease signs did you see? How many vacancies are in your building? And what impact does that have for yourself? So these are just, again, a few components to be aware of as you're looking forward to what's best for you. For those of you on the East Coast, New York, similar situation, right? We've got a very hot historical market. These are some we pulled from the New York area, there's from Queens. So again, similar, large increase in vacancies as an impact of 2020, right? And then since a reduction and a return to 2016 levels of rental rates. So for those of you coming from the city and joining us from the city this evening, right, it's a perfect opportunity now to think, hey, what are fair market rates? What are the rates for my area? What are the rates? What are vacancy rates? What are things like months on market? So if you were to walk away, how many months would it take for the landlord to find another tenant to move in, take over, right? And those months on market are some of the key performance indicators we look at prior to engaging with the landlord and negotiating. Chicago, right? Not quite to the same extremes, but definitely seeing rise in vacancies in comparison to rental rates. New Orleans, right? Massive, really, very high fluctuation. But interesting that certainly through 2020, the market rates really plummeted dramatically in comparison to other markets. And vacancy rates obviously increased, but not quite at the same extent. Baltimore, right? Similar, wide variety of the impact looking through 2016, 2017, 2018, and then obviously sharp decline through 2020. But now, as you can see, right, based on the analytics and software that we utilize, we can forecast that out, that we extrapolate that things will get back to normal sooner than later. So, for those of you wondering, well, hey, when is the right time? Arguably, we're in the span where the inoculations are rolling out, right? Reopening is happening, production's getting back to normal levels, and we're coming and we can see finally the light at the end of the tunnel. So before, dare I say, COVID amnesia sort of falls in the landlord's eyes, it could be a perfect time to be engaging and re-engaging, especially if you have a lease that's coming due within the next 2 or 2.5 years. So that's Baltimore and otherwise. So again, for questions, if you are wondering, as we do have a number of questions starting to roll through, any questions about rental rates, if you're paying fair market rates, what vacancies are in your market and submarket, there'll be a number of areas throughout the course this afternoon, specifically about how to request, or you can request it through info@cirrusconsultinggroup.com. And request for complimentary review or lease analysis. So just an appreciation of your time. We're happy to pull all those reports, schedule a call, and make sure that, again, you are paying fair and accurate rents. Okay, so buying versus leasing, the age-old question. Well, I've had the privilege of being an instructor at the Henry Schein's Dental Business Institute in their headquarters in West Allis, Wisconsin. So I've had the opportunity to share some of this information to many of your colleagues that were opening their first, second, third, fourth, fifth practice and judging to see what makes sense. And in short, there's pros and cons to each. And it does certainly, location is a big factor. So a few things. First of all, if you're buying, can be a great opportunity, especially in some rural or less urban locations, can be a great opportunity to find good opportunities where someone perhaps has stretched themselves too thin. They're looking to get out, they're looking to relieve some cash, they're looking to free up some cash, relieve some debt load, and therefore looking to sell a building for a moderate price. There are opportunities there. However, cash is king right now. And with the flux, and let it be in the markets or Bitcoin or Tesla stock and everything else, there's a lot of fluctuation. So in my opinion, and looking through even some of the largest DSOs out there, they don't own their commercial real estate, right? They choose to take and deploy that capital rather than tying it up in real estate. Anybody can go to a Tony Robbins course, get all excited, get fired up to get a cap rate of 4 or 5% and buy a commercial real estate property, and that's fine, right? However, you as a very exclusive club with DDS or DMD behind your name have the opportunity to reinvest that and potentially open a secondary location with a 10, 20, maybe even 30% margin. And that, when it comes time to eventual sale, well, of course, the demand for practices and the demand for others to acquire those practices remain quite high, and certainly higher than the supply. So therefore, it does create a good opportunity for those to think about, well, look, if you're sitting on a bag of money and you're contemplating next steps, right? Of course, everybody can make money in real estate if they live long enough. However, the question is now, where can you get the best return, and in the long-term return, all the way through the eventual sale of the practice? And if you have, and you're looking through your production and profitability levels and your P&L reports, and you're consistently bringing in active clients, then you, right, deserve some great congratulations and success, considering the amount that you've invested. And you've obviously got the magic touch in providing great clinical care. So there could be more value in adding a second location versus tying up $500,000 or $1 million to buy a piece of real estate. The next is becoming a landlord. And this is something you need to carefully weigh the pros and cons with. If you already are the landlord, you know some of these firsthand. There is if the roof has an issue. And for those of you coming from Texas this evening, certainly our deepest sympathies. We have very close friends down there, certainly in the Houston area and others. Very, very difficult practices, roofs caving in, pipes bursting, devastating. If you do have those, please mark urgent, and we're happy to prioritize those clients in those devastating situations. So we're happy to assist those there and to determine force majeure, right, at what impact there is for the landlord's responsibilities, repairs, and otherwise. For those of you that are your own landlords, then of course you realize you don't have someone to go to, that's on you. If there's, talking to a doctor last week with an asbestos situation, right? So now it's up to them to now go through to fix these issues, roofs, leaks, plumbing, etc. It can become another full-time job. Also, if there's additional tenants in the building that you own, well, now you are 100% a full-time landlord, and you want to be prepared for that. I was doing a CE course down in Las Vegas a few years ago, and I remember hearing the anecdote about a doctor that said, you know what, one of my tenants walked in to my office with a plunger, no joke, and to say, hey, right, my toilet's backed up. What's the doctor going to do to fix it, right? As the doctor's chair side, right, all scrubbed in. So these are the type of things to be aware of. And it's not just the comparison of saying, well, hey, I own my house versus renting my house. I want to own. It's a very different perspective, right, for the business. Of course, there's benefit of rental income. There might be the benefit to think about passive rental income and to pass that on to your kids and estate and to the next generation and be able to keep a tenant in there, again, as a passive form of income. Of course, that is very true and accurate statement. But be prepared for the costs of that and prepare that if, for whatever reason, there's a tenant that might move in down the line, that might be an issue. That if the tenant that you sell your practice to ends up, relocating and taking all the equipment with them, changing the colors, changing the layout, right? Are you going to be okay with that? And then, of course, last but not least, on the buying front, you've got the freedom to control the property. Now, the leasing front, right? There's some benefits there. Of course, those of you looking to open a secondary clinic or your first, obviously smaller upfront payment, initial deposit, right? First and last, if you will, and the ability to move in and have that flexibility, knowing that if things go wrong, it's their responsibility, and that you have the opportunity to move in and get into, in many cases, a more premium type of location with additional foot traffic, with someone else driving some of the key traffic into you and that benefit. In addition to that, obviously, greater working capital that you can be able to build out. And if, for whatever reason, that location or the demographics change over time, or competition moves in next door, or otherwise, you do have the flexibility to relocate or expand. Talking to a number of doctors that, pot committed, bought the practice, bought the building, right? And then also built out the brand new clinic, right? Suddenly now they're riddled in debt for the building on the mortgage, plus the full build out. They are absolutely pot committed moving forward. However, in either case, the dental office lease becomes a critical linchpin, whether you own your own and you are your own landlord, or if you lease, right? The lease is a critical component. So let's, again, I encourage you to ask any questions if this is triggering a couple of ideas. For those of you following along with your lease, we will be going through some practical examples here shortly. So the dental office lease. So let's say, Eric, I own my own, I'm my own landlord. I pay myself out of one pocket into the other. I could do my lease on the back of a napkin. Yes, you are correct. However, right, you can and may be exposing yourself to unnecessary issues down the line. There's principally four main reasons why it's important to have a properly structured lease to separate the corporation that owns your building, right, or yourself if it's in your personal name, to the corporation or the entity that owns the individual clinic. So the four are, number one, is you want to make sure that you are paying yourself fair and accurate market rents. Now, of course, your accountant is there to give you financial guidance on that. But in an audit situation or otherwise, you want to be able to justify that, hey, I'm not just paying myself whenever I can or whatever I can afford or whatever my accountant tells me at the end of the year. right? Far more important, right, in an audit situation to have a clearly executed document that is based on fair market rents, that looks at comparable market rents in the area to make sure that there's no perception that you might be over or under inflating one for the benefit of the other. So again, making sure that you've got accurate financials and paying accurate rent is important, even though it is technically one pocket to the other, if you will. Number two is obviously just from a structure and risk, right? Whom is responsible for what? If, heaven forbid, something happens, there's a liability issue or otherwise, how do we ensure whom is responsible for the building or the outside of the building or the carrying of the building, salting, sanding, etc., right? Versus, right, who's responsible for the other aspects within the building or otherwise. So a clear delineation is important. Number three is also helping to increase the value of the building. Now, you want to give yourself some thoughts as to what type of lease you would want to structure. We'll touch on some of those. Do I want a triple net base rent plus plus plus? Do I want a modified gross lease? Do I want a gross lease? How do I want to structure this? And what do I want now versus also what do I want for my future tenant? So by having a long-term lease in place is what helps to show the value and the benefit as you as a dental tenant, and therefore help to increase the value of the building based on rent rolls, right? Total tenancy and total lease commitments. In addition, you want to think about, and number four is the value for the value of the practice. So ask yourself, if you do own your own real estate today, or you're contemplating it, right, and you're using the same credit card to pay for the faucet or fix the leaky roof or the HVAC system, and you're using the same credit card to buy a new handpiece from Henry Schein, right? Now you've created the situation where all of those, basically those two different entities, you've amalgamated all those costs into one. So we've seen a number of examples where the doctor's then trying to sell or transition, or now COVID has accelerated their transition plans. And suddenly now they pass, right? They pass on all their financials to the Henry Schein Practice Transitions team. And suddenly now it's a mess because, well, how do we know what the true profitability or revenue is for the building versus the practice when, again, they're all amalgamated into one? So again, the lease helps to clearly delineate as to the expenses between those two entities to help ensure that you have the best ability that when you sell, right? What an amazing approach to the buyer to come back and say, well, good news. Hey, Dr. Smith, this is the exact same lease that I've utilized for myself for the past 10 years. And now I'm just assigning that lease onto you as the new tenant, right? And again, the caveat here, which unfortunately there has been some examples through the impact of 2020 and COVID-19, is heaven forbid if something were to happen to you and to pass away. Ask yourself now critically, what is the state of your estate? If you were to pass away today, what, heaven forbid, what impact would that have, right? What would your spouse do? What would your next of kin do? And would they be able to sell both together? Is there someone that's, is there an associate or otherwise that would be able to get a loan for both the building, right, for $1 million, as well as your practice for another $1 million or 1.5 million? Right? That buyer would be far less, right, considering the current market's impact and some of the reluctancy that some lenders may have specifically for that situation. So again, I'm not trying to be alarmist or otherwise, but all of the things we never thought would happen to us in 2020, right, is now an eye-opening experience to say, you know what, I've always wanted to make sure that we've got these and the affairs in order, just like a will and estate plan. Very important that you've got a lease properly structured, separating those two entities. Okay, so that was a bit of the high level, again, of the owning versus leasing and the return. We'll dig into some financial analysis as well. Again, feel free to add questions as we go. I see there's a few in the chat here. Let me just quickly check to see. So a couple of questions here as we go, and some we might hold till the end. A few questions about own to lease, which we can touch on, implications, benefits. And then another question here about rent inexpensive rent in the area, debated buying the building, we're constrained with limited ability to expand the facilities, fuel tanks located. So yeah, a couple of good scenarios here that we'll touch on in some of the clauses. So on the lease to own, great question. That's typically structured through the lease negotiations of something called a right to purchase, or an RTP. Or a right of first refusal to move into the adjacent space. It's a specific carve out that if in the event the landlord chooses to sell, right, or at a particular time, would give you the opportunity to come back and be able to build upon that and basically exercise the option to purchase the building at a particular time, or if in the event someone else is looking to buy the building. There can be some pros and cons with each. To the second question, you're right. That's a perfect opportunity. Hey, I'm in a smaller town throughout the U.S. We're on a main road. I've contemplated buying. Used to be a gas station, fuel tanks, environmental issues, etc. Obviously, depends on a number of locations, the specifics, legislation in your area. Certainly, as you can imagine, fuel tanks, environmental issues, permits, licenses, changes, zoning, etc. Again, you can be bringing yourself into a world of hurt if in the event there is an environmental study found and suddenly now it's your problem to clean up. Maybe they'll, who knows, in a worst case scenario, require you to demolish and make changes. Again, in an ownership situation, you're now taking on all those problems. So be cautious with those type of strategies. We'll come back to some of those as we go. A few components here that you can see. Why is the lease so important? Number one, of course, the lease is the linchpin, right? The location of your practice is the practice, right? It's where your patients come. It's where the patients will continue to come. And the location is the business, right? Ask yourself, if you didn't have a location to come to tomorrow and the key didn't work, right? What impact would that have to your business? Right? Who'd you call? What would you do? This is why, again, very important that the lease is structured in a way to give you as much protection as possible. If you were in a month-to-month situation, you might think, good, hey, less responsibility if the world goes through more strife and turnover. But at the same time, right, if the landlord, posts a brown envelope that states that you're out in 30 days, right, how expensive is that going to be for you? And we've seen a few of those, right, over the past year, where the investment and cost to build out can be absolutely enormous, let alone the time consumption. And let's just say you were in a forced relocation, and in your lease today, there might be a relocation clause that allows the landlord to transfer that lease from one party to the other, that allows the landlord to move you from one unit to another. So again, it's not even the lack of production. We saw that through 2020, right? We were able to come back, roaring demand, but it's the patient attrition, right? And in many cases can be over 8.5% per month for every month that you're closed and lights out, right? Trying to aggressively reopen, where suddenly the building's shut, your practice is shut, and patients go down the road and they never come back. So again, it's just to really reiterate why the lease is so important to structure. And then, of course, last but not least is the lease and that governing document will typically survive all the way through renewals every 5 or 10 years, and then to your eventual transition. So the way that the lease and the assignment section is structured today is the same section that will, on how well you negotiate now, will dictate if and how you can sell the practice and how much control the landlord has to the eventual sale of the practice, which, if you're unaware, in your assignment clause today, which we're going to go through a practical example on, in most cases, you cannot sell your clinic without the landlord giving prior written consent. So from that perspective, let's talk about return on investment. Let's touch on how to save and what are some strategies that we are doing with our hundreds of active negotiations to be able to help our clients save through COVID-19. So as I mentioned, again, to the roughly almost 100 people here that have joined recently a couple of components. So again, the dental tenant now has more leverage, in my opinion, than we've seen in years, 2008 or more so, where vacancies are increasing. We saw the graphs that rental rates are declining in many markets. The dentist can never work from home, highest build out costs, right? And now also seeing opportunities to build, expand, relocate, etc., because of the impacts. Imagine being the landlord down the street just for a second, right? They're in a strip mall. They've just built it 5 or 10 years ago. There's 50% vacancy. Right? Imagine being that landlord to get a phone call from Cirrus, right, representing yourself or otherwise, right, and calling that landlord down the street that is dealing with the landlord starting to call their loan. Right? They've overextended themselves. They're a mom and pop landlord. Can you imagine their joy and elation to get a phone call from an existing practicing dentist who is looking to relocate into their mall, who's looking to build out at 100 or 100 or 200 and $200 per square foot, and looking to secure a new 10-year lease with 2 5-year options. Right? That is a gift to that landlord. And that's how you should be looking, if nothing else, to be renegotiating your current lease to, if nothing else, again, keeping your landlord honest. So let's touch on some strategies now, some real tips and tricks. Number one, we're seeing a lot of success with negotiating with landlords, both from institutionals to mom and pops. Many of them have taken a major hit, a financial hit year over year based on a reduction in rental rates, increase in vacancies and otherwise. Some are down by 50%, some of the large national REITs and otherwise. Capping rental escalations. So what we've found some success with based on the uncertainty of the market, we've been able to secure long-term leases at a flat rate, basically ironing out some of those annual increases, typically 2, 3, maybe 4% per year. We've done a great job lately to advocate to the landlords to help to protect it, perhaps for a 3-year term, then an adjustment, right? Another 3 years fixed, just based on the uncertainty of what 2022 and 2023 are going to look like. So that's a key area that looking through what impact that can have over 5-10 years can be humongous. In addition, researching the market rates. So again, as a benefit and as a complimentary service for all of those that have attended this evening, you'll have the opportunity when you exit or to the poll at the end to request a complimentary lease review and market rate analysis. So we'll look at rental rates, vacancies, etc. Don't go into your next negotiation without that data. Right? If not, what are you going to do? Ask the landlord, hey, what do you want to charge me this time? Oh, good, it's $30 a square feet. You know what? I think 28's better. Okay, back and forth, wasting a bunch of time. Hey, we end up on 29 and off to the races. Yet we're missing the other 35 to 45 to 55 pages of other stuff in the lease that could have impacts far beyond that, let alone the fact that market rate might be now down to 25, right? So be cautious. And typically don't be reactive and ask the landlord. Much better to go in proactively with the data and hit them right where it hurts, which is the wall, right? Dangle that carrot of a new renewal, right? And be proactive. That avoids landlords, right, playing onto their delay and stall tactics. Options to extend are key. Be cautious about just, exercising your option to extend. If you miss that option to renew deadline, that means that the remaining 5 or 2 or 3 5-year options can become null and void if you miss that notice period, which typically can be 6, 9, or 12 months. So again, for those of you following along, please note and put into your phone, when does your lease expire and when is your option to renew deadline date? And my opinion, depending on your situation, right, you want to have all your negotiations complete by and before that option to renew deadline. Because what that states is you agree to everything within the lease with the exception of rent. So you're sort of pigeonholing yourself. Yes, you get another 5 years, but it does and can decrease your leverage with the landlord. So much better off to start 2 years in advance, complete the negotiation, because at least, worst case, you've got the option to extend and what that looks like. In the meantime, give yourself as much protection as possible. Start early, more leverage. And then understanding the operation costs. So we're going to touch on that on the next slide. And then surrendering the space. For some of you that have said, you know what, Eric, I'm I used to practice actual wet finger dentistry back in the 80s, pre-latex. And now I just can't stand going into the operatory, feeling like the Michelin man with PPE all over me. It's just, I need to get out. So in some cases, it might not be that easy. In some leases, look through the surrender clause or the alterations. It might state that before you leave, you are required to return that to pre-dental condition, basically removing medical grade plumbing, electrical, etc., or removing any of the alterations or changes that you might have done all the way back to that lease back in 1985, back to 1995, or 2005. So be cautious of that. Now, to the operating costs. Now, these are a key component. So for those of you that own your own space or are contemplating owning your own space, or for those of you on the leasing front, right, these are key things that we've helped to do over the years to help negotiate and reduce those operating expenses. For those of you in areas that aren't quite aware of these or that are in a gross lease scenario, there are many people on the call tonight that are in a month, that are in a triple net scenario, which is basically base rent plus taxes, maintenance, and insurance. We're talking here about some of those operating costs and that maintenance component, and what in fact is reasonable or unreasonable. Many of you, especially in newer malls, might be paying up to a third of your base rent in additional common area maintenance. So in our opinion, there is a number of reasonable or unreasonable fees, but ultimately it's up to the landlord. And some landlords can use this as an open bag of money to be able to bill and management fees, legal fees, brokerage fees, or if there's more vacancies in the building, you might be paying even more than your fair share, depending on how your lease is structured. So the number one, improvements made to the property. If the landlord's changing certain aspects that are an improvement to the building and improving their asset value, that is something that we've had success with excluding from those common area maintenance fees. And if the landlord's making significant improvements in front fascia or otherwise, why should that be your responsibility when they're getting the upside on the back end when they sell the building? Building repairs is a similar vein, right? Why should those be part of your responsibility if it doesn't necessarily benefit you as the individual tenant? Real estate brokerage commissions. Some of you will be shocked that you and your common area maintenance fees are paying for the brokerage fees of $20,000, $30,000 to fill some of those vacancies in your building, right? So again, be aware of what's being included. We also focus on helping to audit for, create and negotiate for audit rights. Should be the ability that you can get the source documents from the landlord to be able to properly assess and to ensure that you are paying equitable and fair what your lease has agreed you to. Unrelated professional fees, again, might have no benefit to you, might be some dispute with a tenant down at the other end of the building. Again, why should you be bankrolling that on behalf of the landlord? Interest or principal on mortgage payments or debt costs. Some of you might be surprised that those might be bundled into your common area maintenance fees. If there's vacancies in the building, right, do you have to charge more? Is there marketing fees that don't increase traffic to your business as well? And then last but not least, administration fees. We've seen 10, 15% different management fees, etc. Right? Typically, it is a negotiable element that, in our opinion, anything over 5% is pretty unreasonable. Again, what benefit do you get as the tenant? So again, if you're not sure, if you're following along, if you've got a digital copy of the lease, feel free to email us info@cirrusconsultinggroup.com, and that we'll certainly we'll do a review and determine what risks might be within your lease. If you own your own building, well, again, part of the return, think about what you want to do when you eventually sell, right? How do you want that lease structured? If you're a landlord, you might be thinking, okay, well, hey, here's a good opportunity to earn even more from the tenant. So again, it depends on your structure, depends on what you're looking to do. But again, the devil is in the details. So a couple of components here, lease terms to consider for your practice, term and options. So this is very important. Term and the value of your practice, if you really boil right down to it, which we're going to touch on next, It's ultimately the predictability and continuity of the lease. So if you have a 10-year term and you have 2 5-year options, well, that's great. But if those options are personal to you, meaning Dr. John Smith, right, then if you sell your practice at year 9, those options don't transfer. The buyer has no benefit to those. So you might think that, hey, if I stay on, I've got 2 more 5-year options, lots of runway, the bank should have no issues with it. Wrong, they will. And many banks, such as Bank of America or otherwise, if there's insufficient term on the lease, it will not get past their credit department. So it's very important that your lease has enough runway that the buyer can get adequate financing. And typically that means term and options to renew. They're transferable to that new buyer down the road. Practice assignment, we're going to dig into. And then also how to protect your production. I've done a bunch of courses on this. The use provision. You might not have even noticed it, but usually in the first or second page of the lease, it dictates what type of business you can be. Is it just a general dentistry practice? Does it allow you to do any specialties or subspecialties? And for most doctors, if you're bringing on associates or specialists that come in as a 1099 or independent contractor, beware, right? Landlords are becoming wise to the fact that doctors are doing this, just like a vending machine, right? Where now your space, you're now bringing in outside company on a revenue split, 60-40, 50-50, whatever, right? But now suddenly you're now bringing in an outside business that per your lease is not allowed because they could deem that you're subletting that operatory or certain square footage to that outside company, that oral maxillofacial surgeon that might come in once a month for extractions, right? Or an endodontist or periodontist to place implants. There's a lot of risk and exposure, again, if you're doing things within your lease that is not aligned with how the lease is structured, which is why it's so important that regardless of your situation, owner, right, of the building or leasing, that you've got a proper lease structured with the dental specific language. Look, you're not a convenience store, you're not a smoke shop, right? You are, in many cases, a multi-million-dollar business that, when sold, right, that business and that value typically will carry on and is sold at a very high rate. You just don't see that from coffee shops or bagel shops or otherwise. So you should have, why should you have the same lease? So just before we start to get into some practical examples and go to some more Q&A, right? How do we help to create a lease to drive the success in your business? So number one is look at your time. Your time is far too valuable, right? If you're chairside at $500 an hour, $800 an hour, $1,000 an hour, right? Why would you spend time 9 to 5 trying to deal with a landlord, dealing with red line changes back and forth? You're going to get frustrated. And of course, the landlord knows this. They're going to use this to their advantage. They're going to stall, they're going to delay, right? And they're going to, they know that 9 to 5 is your busiest time when you're chairside. Also, right, you want the lease to make sure that it avoids confusion, errors, etc. If you're about to expand, if you're about to perhaps relocate, right, even the smallest detail, recently a doctor reached out, they had a 1/2-inch water intake pipe. Right. Well, suddenly they realized that they couldn't run their handpiece of the compressor without a full inch. And suddenly now they're looking at a $20,000 to $30,000 of additional fees to deal with now water and sewage and moving things around that they thought was the obligations of the landlord. So again, important for the numerous doctors on this evening, making sure that you're aware of what's in the lease. And if you're into a stage where you're looking like a Rockefeller, glass half full, lots of opportunity, right? Just make sure that the amount of money you're about to invest, right, that you've got the best possible structure and commitment from the landlord, because for many of you, right, when looking at $5,000-$6,000 a month, increasing at 2 or 3% per year, you're looking at a $1 to $1.5 million commitment over the next 10, 15, 20 plus years, right? So envision yourself about to sign a $2 million check. Right? That is what that lease can represent. So again, being aware, being strategic, and making sure that you've got the data and as much professional guidance as possible to make sure that you're getting the best possible deal, being that great tenant. Again, I'll quickly pause here for any additional Q&A. I know we've had some good ones thus far. Feel free to post here and we'll jump into some practical examples here in just a moment. One of the questions here is option to renew date in the old lease. So depends. If the question is, where do I find it in your lease? It can be in a few different places. Number one, yes, typically in the original governing lease. And if you bought the practice, whatever the former doctor signed is going to be that aspect. Typically towards the third quarter or final section of the lease or in one of the appendix will be the option to renew, which typically states that within 6 months of the expiry date of the original lease, is the option to renew deadline for an additional 1 or 2 5-year terms. Is a bit of a rule of thumb. So if you had a 10-year term, typically 2 5-year options would be realistic. So that's one. In addition to that, it would also be typically in the amendments. So each and every year, as you renew, or each and every 5 years, typically that renewal should include additional 5-year options. If not, a major mistake many doctors make is they just exercise their option, but they don't make sure there's another one on the end. So in essence, you're sort of on a pirate gangplank. Every time you renew the lease, you're getting closer and closer to the end before you fall off. The last thing you want to be doing is coming up to your sale and when you want to transition and retire, and suddenly there's no term left. So now you have no legal right to stay in the space. And now when you go to sell, now suddenly all of the power resides in the hands of the landlord. Because the new doctor, if there's insufficient term, will be almost impossible to get a loan from the major lenders. So a couple other questions, just as we cover if they're on topic. If I'm in a commercial lease with a fixed term and no extension or renewal period, do I go month to month after the lease is over, or can the landlord kick me out at the end of the lease? In short, that's a very risky and concerning situation. So in a month-to-month situation, that's something called holdover or overholding. In essence, the landlords don't want that because now they have no predictability of revenue. They can't go back to the banks. They can't show that, hey, here's the receivables. Here's the money I'm going to receive. So in many cases, check your lease for the holdover or overholding. In many cases, the landlord can increase your rent by 150 to 200% of your base rent, basically doubling your rent for not only the months that you're now moving forward, but to go retroactively back to the very first month that you became a month-to-month tenant. So some could potentially have liabilities in the tens of thousands of dollars for all the months that they've been in a month-to-month situation. So in short, please don't put yourself into a month-to-month situation. Even a short-term lease, a 6-month, a 12-month term gives far more protection as a result. So can they kick you out at the end of the lease? Yes, which is why it's important to ensure that, especially with COVID and increase in vacancies, now is a great time to say, look, I'm incredibly busy with my practice. I've hired someone to help me negotiate a new lease. I want to make sure it's aligned with the ultimate career goals you have and your long-term plans, and to therefore negotiate a new 5 or 10-year term with multiple options to help ensure that if you're planning to retire or transition in 5 to 10 years, you have that protection. I've got time for one quick more, and then we'll just run through, and then we'll keep the lines open afterwards if there's additional ones. Another question here: what are the pros and cons of a home private practice in the basement of the home you live in, specifically in your better tax benefits while off in your home? So I won't speak to the tax guidance. Bob Gray does a great section. He's another instructor at the Dental Business Institute. So I won't get into the tax perspectives. From the lease, that can be beneficial, but it's also, again, if you're looking to sell and thinking down the line and it's in your basement, well, obviously the buyer, you're now dramatically limiting your buyer pool. Many will not want to either buy your house or live in it or keep it in the basement. If you're just looking to do some additional work, or otherwise, it might be a lot more work and headache to deal with that sort of a situation. Okay, so a few other components here now, 3 sellable components of your practice. So for those of you looking to sell and transition, right, of course, equipment, amortized value. Number 2, goodwill, patient charts, making sure they're audited for patient charts. But what can impact, as you've seen from a few examples now this evening, what can impact 100% of your practice sale proceeds? It is the lease. The lease. Right? If the landlord has the ability to terminate the lease just for asking, right? If the landlord can increase the rent by 5, 10, or 15, 20% upon the assignment of the lease in conjunction with the sale, what would that do to the buyer and the buyer pool? Well, in most cases, it'll send them running. So yes, the lease can impact 100% of the practice sale value. So be cautious of that and make sure that the lease is structured. Now, right, if you're skeptical, let's look at an example together. So again, for those of you following along and you've got any concerns, you can certainly email us at info@cirrusconsultinggroup.com, email us a copy of the lease, and we're happy to do a complimentary lease review as a result and waive the fees in appreciation for your time this evening. And there'll be an exit poll as well to request it for those that didn't on the way in. But let's look at an example. So this is found in 75% of dental leases. Take a quick minute. I've highlighted the first one, but take a quick minute and look through to see any or all of the potential issues that you found through this one clause of 30 or 40 of them in your lease. So take one quick minute, right, and read through. Okay. So in the essence of time, the first one I highlighted, so it states here, first of all, the assignment section describes the role, rights, and responsibilities as it pertains to the sale of the practice, which is principally requiring the assignment of the lease from the seller to the buyer, right? The assignee, the assignor to the assignee. So therefore, it states here that it will have first received consent of the landlord. So if some of you are unaware, that you are unable to sell the clinic without the landlord's prior written consent. Right? Again, if your key doesn't work, if the landlord doesn't like the cut of the buyer's jib, that could be a significant issue. Right? Number 2, so let's say within 15 days of receipt, so you found a buyer, you've negotiated price, you've got it finally done. Oh, what an exhausting process. Oh, shoot, we better notify the landlord and get the lease transferred over. The landlord now, as you can see here in red, has 3 choices. Number 1, approve, right? Number 2, deny, no. Or number 3, to terminate the lease agreement upon the effective date of the proposed lease assignment. So basically the date you were planning to retire and sell, right? Now the landlord not only is saying no, but is basically tearing up the lease and saying now, unfortunately, you're done. You've got 8 years left and 2 5-year options. The landlord now has the ability to say no and terminate the lease, right, without any particular rhyme or reason. So that, imagine, right, at the end of the term, that landlord could get engaged directly with your buyer. And again, ask yourself, if you didn't have a location, how much is your practice worth? So very important, right? The investment in a properly structured lease is similar to putting a protective force field around your eventual practice sale proceeds. And for those of you that own your own clinic, this is still just as important. How much control do you want to have if your buyer eventually then sells? Right? Here's another one. Landlord shall have the right to revise the minimum rent to be paid during the remainder of the term to the greater than the then current market rate for the lease premises or 15% greater than the current rent. So there's no loss, right? The landlord's on the winning streak. You're on the world's most boring roller coaster. It's going up and up and up. And when the lease renewals, it goes up even more. So if your lease is coming up for renewal right now or within the next 2 years, and you've got this type of clause, then you absolutely want to get a new lease negotiated prior to this option or prior to selling, because now the landlord could dramatically increase it, right? Just because you've sold the practice. right? And that, again, put yourself in the buyer's shoes. What would the buyer do? They'd run for the hills, right? Just for buying it, the landlord's going to increase rent by 15% or more. Now, this is key. In the essence of time, this is the consideration clause. And for some of you, the landlord may put language in that in the event that you are to profit, receive any cash or consideration as a result of assigning the lease or selling your practice and transferring that lease over, the landlord, there has been, it's shocking, but the landlord could deem that it's their foot traffic that is the value to your eventual practice sale, not all your blood, sweat, and tears, and therefore they are entitled to a percentage of the practice sale proceeds. So let me state that again. When you sell, the landlord, based on the assignment language, right, could deem that they're entitled to a percentage of the practice sale proceeds, the money, the profit you get when you sell and go into retirement. Could you imagine at the end of a career, finally on the verge of retirement, now dealing with this landlord who's trying to come after and get as much as they can? And last but not least, again, one thing to look out for is that in the event, right, that even after you sell the practice, right, they shall remain liable. You shall remain liable for any failure of the tenant or subtenant or assignees or subtenants to observe each and every covenant within the lease, which is very common, right? In probably over 80% to 90% of leases, even after you sell the clinic and you transfer the lease onto your buyer, right, you will remain continually liable for that lease. So meaning that if the buyer defaults 2, 3, 4 years later, right, that landlord can leapfrog them and come directly after you. And if your lease is in your name personally, or if you've signed a personal guarantee, now the landlord can come after your personal assets. So it's as if you co-signed a car for your neighbor's teenager, and then you move out of town, right? You have zero visibility, zero control, and you're done. You're retired in California and Florida, Texas, wherever, right? Now you are continually liable for that space, and in most cases, for all the renewal terms thereafter. So you should be very, very, very aware of what is residing within your assignment clause. So here's just one example where, again, this whole section should be completely revised and amended. And part of what our legal and leasing team does is really focus on helping to make sure that it's structured properly with dental specific language with 26 years of intellectual capital from it. So the cost of this one mistake could prevent you from selling, right? Have to absorb significant cost increases in rent or decrease the price of the eventual proceeds. Not uncommon to see, $250,000 to $750,000 worth of potential risk down the line. So good news, we've got another 3 hours here tonight together. So we're going to go through each and every one of these examples. I'm kidding. But these are definitely, if you want to take a screenshot or otherwise, these are certainly things to make sure that you're looking out for within your lease. If you're not sure about certain things like a death and disability, I would strongly encourage each and every one of you to make sure in your next renewal negotiations, insert a dental specific death and disability clause. So heaven forbid, if something happens to you or your ability to practice dentistry, right, you or your estate have the ability to either terminate the lease within a particular 30, 60 period of time, or your estate would be able to not be held in default because you're not there and would be able to renew the lease in preparation for sale. Lots of other things in the essence of time. If you have questions, I'm happy to stay on afterwards to go through, or would strongly encourage sending us a copy of the lease, requesting a complimentary lease review, and I'm happy to myself or one of the members of my senior consulting team to assist. So perfect timing on that note. Again, an appreciation for your time for all Henry Schein clients and for attending the webinar tonight. We're willing to waive the fee for the critical dates and risk analysis, the dental lease review, and also provide the rental rate analysis to ensure that you're paying fair and equitable rents. So we'll spend a number of hours up front doing the analysis of the lease, determining risk, determining where you're at. If you're in a month-to-month situation, would strongly suggest to have that reviewed prior to going into your next negotiation, if nothing else, to get a better understanding as to where you sit and where you have leverage. And then also in the end, we'll come up with a good understanding for your past, present, and future and objectives, and then coming up with a specific negotiation treatment plan in the end. So again, I'll pause here. We'll go through some questions. I see a whole slew have come in. Before we go to the questions, please take a quick minute here to add the second poll. If you missed the first, please take a minute to complete this. If you did do the first, please again go through to make sure it's complete. Again, are you presently a tenant with a lease today? Yes or no? When does that current lease expire? Again, if it's within the next 2 to 3 years, it might be an ideal time to start the process early. If you're looking to expand, if you're looking to make a considerable investment or really any sort of a change to the space, if there's something in it for the landlord, best to engage them first. Don't go out and spend a couple $100,000 worth of gear 2 or 3 years prior to renewing your lease. The landlord's going to laugh at renewal time. You're not going anywhere. You just spend $100,000 to equip another op or two, right? So best to renegotiate that before making the big expense. And maybe, just like we did for Dr. Sam Thatcher, for the dentist for the San Francisco Giants, we're able to get a bunch of renewal money, right? For flooring and paint and otherwise, just in exchange of renewing his lease. And then also, again, for those that are in Texas or in areas that have been significantly hit with damage, destruction, or otherwise, or if you're in a month-to-month situation, please denote urgent, and we'll prioritize those lease reviews. And then again, for those that haven't already, right, or have, just click yes to ensure that we receive that for a complimentary lease review. I see the vast majority are still here, so we'll jump into some of those key questions. Again, through the chat feature or through the Q&A, feel free. They're all coming in as anonymous, so that'll give the good opportunity to post some, and we'll cover those here as we go. Happy to keep the lines open for a little while longer for any additional questions. Happy to help. You're not alone through all of this. First question is it common for the tenant to provide repairs and fixtures, etc., and then be required to leave fixtures after vacating? Yes. So unfortunately, there's been a number of examples where the client goes out and buys some beautiful A-deck cabinetry, affixes them to the space without realizing that if the trade fixtures are not clearly defined in the lease, right, and the landlord states that, hey, anything that is affixed to the space becomes their property as soon as it's installed, then that can absolutely have an issue. And of course, all it takes is the landlord to walk around with a clipboard at the end of the lease and say, hey, these look great. No, I want to own them. Well, now suddenly you've got a $500 an hour legal problem, right, to try to figure out who is responsible for what and who actually owns them, right? So to answer your question, from that perspective, you do want to make sure that the landlord, anything that you build or add or tenant improvements are typically owned and become the asset of the landlord. But even worse, they try to have their cake and eat it too. They'll also put in provisions that state that on your exit, right, the landlord can require you to remove it all and return it to pre-dental condition, which if I was advising a buyer looking to acquire your practice and there was a restoration clause in there, and that buyer is now going to be taking over the sins from your poorly negotiated lease, that could be an additional $5,000, $10,000, $15,000 of extra risk and liability if in the event that the landlord may require that future tenant, your buyer, to return it to pre-dental condition. Hopefully that answered that one. Another one, how much does it cost to use Cirrus to negotiate the lease? Yeah, great question. So it depends. In some cases, depending on scope, could be based on just purely time, could be based on if it's just assigning a lease, right? We've got a menu price depending on the scope, or things that are done on a flat rate basis. So again, we've done over 12,000 of these. We pay for ourselves, let it be through the financial improvements, right? 7 main financial variables. If you're looking at a new lease: base rent, annual increase, common area maintenance, fixturing, free rent, landlord work, plus others. Any one of those could potentially save tens of thousands of dollars over the term, let alone the reduction of risk through the lease. So hopefully that covered that question. Again, through the complimentary lease review, we'll determine scope. Happy to assist if you'd like someone to do all of that back and forth for you. That is exactly part of our service offering. Okay, next, doctor. A developer buying many old houses in the area and paying almost double the market value. I've heard this song before. I have a lease for 10 years. I use 6 years with 2 5-year options with predetermined rent transferable and first right of refusal for the lease, okay? Therefore, the developer, the buyer cannot get rid of me. Maybe. I want to buy it, but I can't afford to pay double the market price since no bank will give me the mortgage, even if I pay up to 30% down. What are my options? So great question. These are a lot of the business types of decisions that people are looking proactively to say, hey, what does it mean for me? What are the benefits and what can I do? So the first part of the question here is, well, hey, can the developer make life difficult for me? So if they're to buy the building, the short answer is yes, they can make life very difficult. A doctor who attended one of my CE courses up north, they basically stopped heating. They stopped doing the sewer work. They stopped water. There was a smell. There was vacancies everywhere. They weren't renewing leases. So, you're right. Maybe contractually, you might have term and options, and you can easily, say, hey, I'm not doing anything. But don't underestimate the power of a developer, that you're like the old man in the movie Up, right? You're the last person in the way of a multi-million-dollar development. They can make life very difficult. So depending on your situation, yes, right? Obviously, a good lease is key. One of the Henry Schein team came up from one of the clients we negotiated a lease for in Cincinnati. He shared the story that because of the strength of the lease, the landlord and the developer ended up having to buy him out, right? Because of the strength of that lease, and it was close to $1 million as a buyout. So, of course, doesn't happen every day, but you do want to be very clear and look for any loopholes. The landlord could look for something as simple as the hours of operation, and that if you're in violation of the minimum hours of operation, then that could be enough. That could then invalidate or put you in default, or basically call the remaining options to become null and void. So be very cautious about if you're going to get tough with the developer and you're going to push back, that can work, but you really want to make sure you have all your ducks in a row and be prepared for a fight. Next question here, what clauses typically contain an amount of time needed to notify the landlord of termination of the lease? I'm not too sure of your question here, doctor. What clauses typically contain amount of time needed to notify the landlord of termination of the lease? So if you're talking about the option to renew deadline, typically that's 6 to 12 months. In terms of termination, most landlords aren't willing to give an arbitrary termination right. When you wake up in the morning, what I think about, I'm thinking of walking across the street, hey, here's my 60 days notice. You are making a financial and full commitment over the term of that lease, and very unlikely you've got an arbitrary termination right. But there are a number of clauses that are very time sensitive that you want to be aware of with some of those critical dates. Feel free to email us a copy of that lease. We're happy to schedule a time and to review and maybe get more clarity on it. Next question here. If a lease renewal was never signed, is the tenant considered to be month to month? I'd need a little more data on that, doctor, but in short, it depends. Principally, though, if you were presented a proposal and nothing was executed on, then yes, right? It would be whatever the last countersigned executed agreement would be in a simple situation would be the governing document. If something was proposed, if there were some emails, maybe even a draft, again, if it wasn't signed, it's not worth the paper it's written on. So yes, if you are in that situation, if they proposed it, even if you're paying that new rent, you're in a very unique situation and a difficult situation, because what would you do if the landlord suddenly, or a new landlord, bought your building and suddenly gave you that, 30, 60 days notice and kicked you out? You really want to have everything buttoned down. You want to have everything signed, countersigned. And that's one of the first things you want to have structured is a long-term lease with options, and making sure that not only is it signed by you, but it's also countersigned by the landlord. Another big mistake many doctors make, they sign it, okay, I'm done, right? They don't actually get a countersigned copy. So right? You don't have anything that's actually committed the landlord. You might have dealt with a broker. Who knows, right? If it wasn't signed by them, right, you are leaving yourself exposed as well. Again, still a large number of attendees. Happy to keep it open for another few minutes. Any additional questions? I've got some great examples here, again, that can certainly be shared or reviewed afterwards. There's lots of components of thinking about financial evaluation. If for those of you that can still see the screen, this is just a quick example for those of you that stayed on, of looking at all the different financial variables. So you can adjust all sorts of elements here of square footage and impacting, looking at the amount that you're paying in rent, the impact of two different types of strategies. If you're looking to sell, if you're looking to relocate, if you're looking to get out in the near future, right? It depends, right? Look at the difference between a 2 and a 4% annual increase, some slight differences in annual rent, and the difference in common area maintenance. Over the first 10 years alone, right, it's over $50,000 in difference. So you might think, hey, you know what? Taking a greater amount of tenant improvement allowance money from the landlord might be best. Well, actually, if you were to negotiate it differently, negotiate for lower rent with a lower annual increase, even over the first 10 years, you could be saving over $50,000. Over 20 years, could be over $350,000 of total savings. So don't underestimate the amount of financial commitment that you're giving, and be cautious about trying to take or getting specific money from the landlord. You want to be aware of all the financial variables, and some of the software we use helps to protect yourself from that level. So again, I'll pull up all my contact details. Any questions? Again, I usually get a couple of calls afterwards. If you do have an urgent situation, we're happy to assist. I know this is a very nervous time. Heck, we're just getting through the world's worst pandemic. But again, you're not alone. We're here to assist. Good to see a lot of club doctors have already emailed through. So again, we're happy to support. We're happy to assist. On the exit, you can also request that complimentary lease review. You can go to cirrusconsultinggroup.com/lease, request a lease review, info@cirrusconsultinggroup.com, right? Or call through 866-739-9075, extension 3231. We'll go through to the general voicemail line, or 3255 is my own personal extension, just to share. Another good question here: what types of repairs should be paid by the leaseor versus the leasee? So, and great question. In short, it depends. Right? It's a frequent answer, but it really does depend on what's within the lease and what you've negotiated for. So if, right, in a properly structured lease, we may have been able to ensure that the HVAC becomes the responsibility of the landlord. Maybe, maybe not. Depends on the landlord, depends on the situation. We did recently negotiate a lease for a doctor, and we were able to get the landlord to cover $15,000 to pay for a brand new HVAC system because it was old and needed repair and needed replacement. So depends on your situation, depends on your lease in terms of what is your responsibilities versus the landlord's. But before you do any significant major repairs or otherwise, good to review your lease, have it professionally reviewed. If you're coming from the Texas area or Oklahoma or otherwise, definitely try to avoid your expenditures. I know you're anxious to get up and running, but right, if you had a properly negotiated lease, you might be able to have the landlord incorporate and cover a lot of those key costs. So again, very important from that perspective. Any other additional questions? You've got Q&A or the notes section. Again, another question here specifically about timing. Again, if your lease is coming up for renewal in the next 2 years, that is a great time to start. If you own your own location, look, it's heaven forbid something were to happen to you. If your estate is not properly structured for transition, a lease will definitely protect you. Let's say your building is in your spouse's name and you've got a nephew that is a potential partner or a minority owner of your practice corporation. Well, look, heaven forbid if something were to happen to you, right? Now suddenly it's your wife versus your nephew. There's no lease in place. You're just creating unnecessary strife for the family. and your estate. So the more proactive investment you make, the more clarity, right? It's a smooth transition. The practice knows what its responsibilities are. The building knows what its responsibilities are. And it adds for, again, just a proper structure and less stress and confusion at a very challenging time. Okay, Adam, I promised I wouldn't keep you too late tonight. Great questions. We'll keep it over for another sort of 30 seconds. And then Adam, I'll pass it back to you here.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Eric, for your time this evening. If anyone does have additional questions about your dental lease, feel free to email Cirrus directly, or you can email us at webinars@henryschein.com, and we'll be sure to connect you with the Cirrus consulting team. Additionally, if anyone is interested in attending future Henry Schein webinars, please visit henryscheindental.com/webinars for our upcoming schedule. As a thank you for attending tonight, everyone will receive this recording via email sometime later this week. And I would like to thank you all for attending, and we hope to see you back here on future webinars. Have a great night.
Thank you very much, everybody. Greatly appreciate it. Looking forward to speaking to many of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.